Hi there, I'm Dr. Nicola Dellinger, and I'm so glad that you're joining us live today because we have a legend in the office. Yeah, please. She's a dear friend and has been a mentor of mine since I was in school. This is Dr. Louise Edwards, so thank you so much for being here.
My joy. Yeah. Hello, everybody.
And Louise and I were having breakfast last week, and we started talking about this idea of letting go of being the driver, and what you so eloquently named as having faith in the unfolding.
Right.
And so, how that has shifted everything that's coming into your world. So
profoundly.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, the story, as we were discussing, really started in the early 2000s when I went through some profound personal changes, and I was going through a period of reevaluation, and I did what's called a death practice in the Buddhist tradition, where you wake up and say, life is precious, death is certain, the time of death is uncertain, and so therefore how do you want to live your life? And in that, I sort of turned that question around, and I said to myself, if I were to die, would there be something that I would regret? And in the process of that evaluation, I realized that there was something that I would regret, and that was this piece about calling what I call living in faith. So throughout my life, I have had the experience of being led, often at really critical junctures in my life. That was the way I became a naturopathic doctor, a longer story, or moved to Durango, for instance. Okay. And so I have always had this sense of a connection with a higher order that informed my life, right? But then I thought about it, and I said, well, I don't think this is just happening at significant moments, that this access to this guidance could be moment to moment, right? And so I thought, I want to find out if that really works. If I could, as you said, let go of the wheel. So I've been able to really make a lot of things happen in my life. And I feel confident. At that point, I felt confident. I had enough money in the bank that if everything went south, I could recover, right? I still had my profession, right? But then I thought, why don't I just do an experiment and see, instead of being the driver and making all the plans, which I'm really good at, how about if I let go of the wheel and live more by a sense of revelation, if you would, or moment-to-moment inspiration. And so I started doing that, and that's what you alluded to. I call having faith in the unfolding, that there is some higher order that's acting in my own life, and that if I stay centered and pay attention, that I will know what it is to do, even moment to moment, throughout the day. I'll stop and do that. And now I'm 17 years into this, and it's been a fabulous experiment. No regrets.
Okay. So how do you maintain your center?
Well, I have a deep Buddhist meditation practice that has been there for decades now. So sitting quietly is part of it. A large part of it. Okay. I have been consciously practicing working with my own buttons and cultivating self-awareness, and trying to get the places where I'm stuck or unclear to really work with those. And that's one of the great things about aging. I haven't got the whole thing cracked yet, but
I'm working on it.
A lot of the stuff has gotten out of the way. And then I take good care of myself. I know that as a naturopathic doctor. I get enough sleep, I hydrate adequately, I eat well, I have good social connections, and I exercise a lot. All of those things actually really have a fundamental effect
Yeah.
on my overall centered and well-beingness.
Mm-hmm.
And I spend a lot of time outdoors.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that's something we talk about a lot, is this idea of getting outside. And there's actually, have you heard of this whole biophilia?
Oh, the love of nature,
Yep.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, scientifically studied.
I know, which is crazy to me. What I found so interesting about the whole biophilia movement was that we've gotten so far removed from nature that we had to create this subset of science that actually explores and researches our human connection to the natural world, because so many of us, over half of us in this country are living in an urban environment now.
Well, that's planetary now. Somewhere in the mid-2000s,
Okay.
The United Nations announced that for the first time in the history of the planet that there were more people living in urban areas than rural areas.
Yeah.
So we're just naturally disconnected from the most essential needs, our relationship with nature,
Right.
which is been our and still is our home, our absolute necessity for all of our health needs, our food, our water, our air, as well as for our mental, emotional well-being. And so there's this interesting disconnect now, because people don't have to understand or even be in relationship with nature.
Right. Yeah, we can avoid nature altogether in a day, which is totally wild to me. I mean, that's why we live in Durango. But it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to hike a 14er every day.
Oh, no.
But it can mean that you find a tree that's near your house or your office, or you take your shoes off and walk in the park, or you park a little further away than where you're going and walk for 4 or 5 minutes.
Exactly. And oftentimes, it's interesting because throughout my day, I will periodically stop, and when I've accomplished something, I'll say, okay, what now? And I'll sit someplace. And oftentimes, if the weather's warm, I'll go out to my garden. I love to garden. I've got this
amazing
sweet little garden. Yeah. And sit there and say, okay, now what? And just being in that environment, that feels like it centers me, and it helps me to be clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was another one of my questions, kind of going back to this idea of being led or inspired.
Yeah.
How do you access that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because we have a lot of ways of naming our ability to connect with reality, if you will. We have our 5 senses, but we have what's often alluded to as a sixth sense, or an intuition, or insight, and that access can come in a lot of ways. This has actually been extensively studied. I teach about this at the medical school in Chicago.
Cool.
And we each have different ways that we sense things. Some of us have more of a somatic, a body response, maybe a gut feeling, or we might hear, not literally hear voices, but have a sense of hearing something, or have an image of something. So for me, I have kind of a combination of an auditory and a sensate way of knowing, and I'll just quiet myself down and I'll ask, okay, what now? Or if I'm trying to make a decision, I'll pose the options as statements, and then wait until I have a sense, which for me is usually in my heart area, but sometimes elsewhere. And then there's this knowing, I would say, that just arises. And when I first started this, I was in as I said, a turbulent transitional time in my life, and I decided that the answer to everything at that point was going to be, I don't know, until I know, in my heart of hearts. So right there at the start, I was like, okay, I'm going to listen. And when the answer is right, I like to say I have a compass on board in my heart. Then there is a physical sensation of sort of a lightness, if you will, and also a clarity of thought that comes with it. And sometimes it's just as simple as, okay, now's the time to go get the groceries. And then amazingly, like this happened not too long ago, I thought, oh, it feels like now's the time, go get the groceries. I got to the grocery store and walked in for the 5 minutes that this friend of mine, I hadn't seen her in years, she was passing through town, she stopped at the grocery store, and I walked in and there she was. So it feels like when I follow that guidance, there are all sorts of, I'm going to use the word magical things, but unexpected, beautiful, synchronous events that come together by just being willing to stop and listen.
Well, and I think that's where, as we practice listening to our knowing, so much more is going to come in to your access, because what's available to you is beyond what your brain can logically figure out sometimes. But so talk to me a little bit, because I think for most of us, the idea of letting go and not driving the train is like, like I'm the only one making sure we don't go off the tracks. And if I let go, you know, I was just sitting with somebody earlier, and she was like, if I let go, all hell's gonna break loose, and that's like a survival level fear.
Very much.
So how did you let go?
Well, as I said in the preface to this, that I was at a point in my life where I was quite stable. I had my own home, I had a good business, I had a little bit of money in the bank. So I had a foundation of security at that point that made it safer for me to do this in a larger way. But previous to that, really all of my life, I've had a very strong connection with whatever we name the higher order. I like to talk about the divine or the Holy One, or just simply the One. And I had many experiences of synchronous events or revelation working for me, and I started cataloging those things. I was like, look at all the ways that this has worked, right? And so I had some evidence of experiencing being led and having that work out, right? I was like, okay, so that was the thing that inspired me in the first place. If in all of these major ways I've had synchronous events come together and work for me, well then could this work moment to moment? So I think starting with looking at either the large ways or the little ways in which we see coincidence or synchronicity working in our life, that for me that's one of the obvious clues, right? And we can trust those events, then it makes it a little bit easier to let go. And you know, the backup plan is, you know, you can stop and listen and see if you get any information, and if you don't, well, re-engage and grab the wheel. Right.
Cool. Well, I think that's important though, because I feel like not everybody is coming from a stable place like that.
No,
right?
not at all, of course.
And so I don't want you to think that you have to have this perfect stability with X amount in the bank and your house paid off and a good job and all these things, because actually those things can be created from this approach.
Well, and that's one of the most fascinating things, because what happened for me, and you and I have been friends through this period, is that I went from being a full-time clinician to now being a full-time adjunct professor at the naturopathic medical schools. And all of that unfolded through this process. For instance, I kept having students like you, or patients say, you should be teaching, you should be writing. I was like, I should be teaching and writing? I'm a doctor, I'm practicing, right? But I started listening, and so then I put it out there, and I said, I went to the schools and said, okay, I'm interested in teaching. And right away, these opportunities fell into place immediately. So that started working for me. And then at the end of 2004, when I turned 50, I took 2 years off to dedicate myself to, I thought, writing first, then teaching. then within 3 months of that, a man who I'd met once, Dr. Fraser Smith, who is now my boss at the National University of Health Sciences, he came to me and said, I know you're really busy, but I'd like you to come be the philosophy department at this new program. Well, I wasn't busy. He didn't know that, nor did he know that I'd just taken a 2-month sabbatical a 2-year sabbatical to move towards this writing and teaching, which I felt like I was being guided towards, right? And so within 3 months of putting that down and expressing my willingness, all of a sudden I have this job in Chicago where they're willing to fly me in, put me up, and pay me to teach what I want to teach. I didn't organize that. I didn't even know the school existed. Right? And a man who met me once in a meeting where we were talking about philosophy curriculum decides I'm his gal.
Right. So you didn't even know this opportunity existed.
Oh, not even. No.
Right. So I think that's the message, though, is that we effort so hard to get what we think we want.
Yeah.
And when we let go, we actually receive everything we wanted and times 10.
Well, and here's another lovely piece about that particular event. So the naturopathic school was just starting up there in Illinois, and there weren't a lot of other doctors around to be able to teach, and I had experience teaching already the subjects he wanted. So when he told me this new school had started, I said to him, so where's the school? And he said, Chicago. And I said, I'm not moving to Chicago. Because I would just die on the vine in Chicago. Sure. And he said, well, let me see what I can do about that. And so he went back to the administration, and they said, well, let's fly her in and put her up. And he came back to me and said, okay, so would you fly in? Could we get you to come that way? And both Fraser, Dr. Smith, and I laugh about this in retrospect, because having been there for 13 years now, right, having built this program, we look at this and realize from our experience with the management in economics there, it's like, how the heck did that happen? You know, that there was no precedent for that. They've never done anything like that since, right? And yet it just flowed. We call it our minor miracle.
Not minor.
Well, it was major.
So the last question that I have for you is, how do you think, having faith in the unfolding and kind of allowing, getting still, quiet, coming back to your higher self for guidance, how do you think that impacts your health or the health of people who want to, how does this impact health and disease?
Oh, that's lovely. And I can actually quote a little bit of science around this.
Ooh, I love it.
Which is lovely. So are you familiar with the book The Blue Zones?
No.
The Blue Zones is a book that was just published recently, funded by National Geographic. And they, I think the author is Dan Buettner. Fairly certain that's accurate. And what they did over, I think, about a decade's period of time, is they found the 4 places on the planet where people were most long-lived. They wanted a lot of centenarians, not just a few, and male and female, and where there was a very low incidence of chronic degenerative diseases. And so they found those 4 spots in Japan, Okinawa, the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, Icaros, which is an island in Greece, and Sardinia in Italy. And so they brought in medical doctors, public health people, social workers, all sorts of people to evaluate, were these people as old as they were, had they lived like this consistently, and what were the common themes among the people who had lived extended lives. And a lot of it, and disease-free, and a lot of it was what we would have expected. Whole foods, grown locally, regular exercise, having a sense of purpose, actually, to get up for. But one of the fascinating things that they found among this population is that all of them had some degree of faith in a higher order. And it could, for many of them, it was Christian or Buddhist, or I'm sorry, I don't remember the Okinawans, whether it's Taoist or Buddhist. but that all of them had this sense that they would be taken care of, and that they could trust in that to one degree or another.
Huh.
And that in and of itself reduces stress, right? Because
Sure.
if I can turn over and say, okay, show me the way, right? And I always, I think this is important to say, I personally set an intention and say a prayer. I always start with, may this be for the highest good of all of us, myself included.
Mm-hmm.
And then I say, may I have the clarity, the insight, the wisdom, the strength, and the courage. I've always prayed for the courage in this to see and know and be able to carry through on this guidance, right? So for me, I don't have to worry so much about things, and I can say, okay, just show me the way. Right? What do I do next?
Mm-hmm.
And it just repeatedly, over and over again, it seems to easily flow with all of these events that I wouldn't have even known to line up.
Sure.
And the more that happens, it's sort of like going back to, I started with, I know that there are have been times in my life where I felt led and it worked out beautifully,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And cataloging those, it made me feel a little bit braver. And so now after 17 years, I'm like, yeah, this is a no-brainer. Just, okay, now what? Right?
Yeah. And so you probably have more, enjoy better health on not only a physical plane, but a mental, emotional plane.
Well, and I strongly believe that our psyche leads. I mean, I've been in this medicine for 34 years now, 30 years as a practicing physician, and the more I practice, the more I see the profound power of our thoughts, and how even with significant pathology, when somebody comes true to themselves and starts experiencing more joy and truth within themselves, that this pathology alleviates without an herb or without a supplement. The state of our consciousness has a profound impact on our physical health. So I don't think this is a minor thing. I think this is really
everything.
Core
Mm-hmm.
to our well-being. And there's a ton of science now about the effect of our mental emotional state on our physical health, and not just around biochemistry, but actually on how our intentions have some sort of non-physical impact on our own well-being as well as others.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is amazing.
Really fun. Thanks.
This is Louise Edwards. She's an amazing teacher and mentor and friend. And so blessed to have her here when she pokes into town between teaching gigs. Please, if you have questions for myself or Dr. Louise, post your comments below, or share your stories around how when you've let go, or maybe you were forced, your fingers were pried off the driver wheel. When you tell us your stories about when what you thought should happen didn't happen, that created so much more, or that when you finally just let go, everything lined up. So please share.
Or when you listened, like we often have hunches or an intuition, right? And I always ask my class this. I say, have you ever had a hunch about something and not followed it? And how did that work out, right? Or a hunch about something and you do follow it, and how does that work out? So, we can look at how that is in our own lives and in the lives of those people around us, and start opening up that conversation. I think that would be lovely things to share as well.
Yeah, and so I think the invitation for today would be start jotting down those times, those coincidences that are happening, and acknowledge your role in creating your life. And because I think we blow off of like, that was an interesting coincidence, or isn't that funny that that happened that way, rather than owning like, wow, this was something that I called into my consciousness and that I co-created, because I was in alignment. And as soon as you start acknowledging when those things are occurring, then you become more aware of them, and then they're more in your consciousness, and it starts snowballing in a really positive way.
And then you develop more faith in the unfolding.
Which is not always easy to hold on to.
No, it's true.
It is where we can come back to a place of peace.
Absolutely.
So, please feel free to share this video. Thanks so much for everybody who's watching live and watching recorded after the fact. And just please keep in touch and share your stories, and let's keep inspiring one another. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
See you next time.